Today we're going to discuss ecosystems. Ecosystem, simply defined, is a community of living organisms and their interactions with their abiotic or non-living environment. This very much rolls into those ecological interactions that we've been talking about all semester long. And there are different types of ecosystems on our planet that fall into pretty broad categories. So here we have the three main ecosystem types, what they look like, and how we can recognize them. So first, we have the freshwater ecosystems. These are all of the lakes, ponds, rivers, streams, springs, bogs, and wetlands that especially we have around here in East Tennessee. We unfortunately in Tennessee are landlocked, so we don't have the second type of ecosystem, the marine ecosystem. This ecosystem type includes a vast diversity of different types of environments, including the ocean, of course, but also contains salt marshes, mudflats, seagrass meadows, mangroves, rocky intertidal systems, and our beloved coral reefs. All of those fall under the umbrella of a marine ecosystem. And then finally, we have the terrestrial ecosystem. This is the tundra in our Arctic locations, taigas, temperate deciduous forests, tropical rainforests, grasslands, and deserts. All of these extremely variable in their environmental types, but they all fall under the terrestrial ecosystem sphere. So what characterizes all of these are ecological interactions between living and non-living things. Let's take a look at one of the common threads between all of these ecosystem types, and that is the food chain. And the food chain is simply a linear sequence of organisms through which nutrients and energy pass. The chain represents a single path, with each organism occupying a different trophic level. So depending upon their role as either producers or consumers, species or groups of species can be assigned to various trophic levels. And in many ecosystems, the bottom of the food chain consists of photosynthetic organisms like plants or phytoplankton. These are called primary producers. The organisms that consume the primary producers are herbivores, and we consider this to be a primary consumer. Now, anything that eats the primary consumer, we would call a secondary consumer. These are usually carnivores, and they prey upon the primary consumers. In some ecosystems, we can then have an additional trophic level of tertiary consumers. These are carnivores that eat other carnivores. Higher level consumers feed on the next lower trophic level, so on and so forth. So technically you could have levels above this one, but regardless of how many links are in your food chain, the top predator or the top consumer, we would call the apex consumer. So here we have in this food chain, diagramming the chain from green algae, mollusk, to slimy sculpin, to salmon, the salmon would be our apex consumer. Now, what's interesting about a food chain is that we consistently lose energy at each and every step of that food chain. So this is a major factor that limits the length of the food chain, simply because the higher up you go, the less and less energy is able to be available. So this is because of simple law of thermodynamics. You lose heat at each and every level. So here we have one of the groundbreaking studies that showcase the loss of energy at each trophic level that happened in the 1940s. The scientists calculated the energy content in kilocalories per meter squared per year. And what they found is that primary producers contain the vast amount of energy available in the ecosystem, followed next by primary consumers, then secondary consumers, then tertiary or apex consumers. And here we just have a pyramid model that shows the same data. So what all of this is communicating is that there's actually more energy gained from eating plants as a primary consumer than there is being a strict carnivore or a tertiary or secondary consumer. Now, the idea of a food chain is a pretty simple idea. And as you know, nature is very, very complex. Therefore, in contrast to a food chain, we have something that's called a food web. This is a more accurate and holistic model because it accounts for all of the interactions between different species and their complex interconnected relationships with each other and also with the environment. This is a graphical representation over here that just goes to show you that there are multiple groups of species that occupy these different trophic levels, and sometimes they can even prey upon other species within the same level. So how do we study food web interactions and trophic level interactions? Scientists have different approaches, one that's based on experimental systems in the field and one that can be translated to the laboratory. So first we have the idea of the mesocosm. These are experimental systems that involve partitioning a part of a natural ecosystem so that it can be used for experimental study and manipulation. So here we have an example of some mesocosms in a bog. You'll notice that these are pulled off into different sections. Perhaps these represent different mesocosm treatments to test differences in primary production in changes in temperature or increased amounts of dissolved organic carbon. In contrast to the mesocosm, we also have microcosms. And these are experimental systems that involve recreating an ecosystem entirely in an indoor or an outdoor laboratory environment. So here at the bottom, we have some examples of microcosms. They're studying the same type of organism, so a green algae, but instead of being outdoors in a mesocosm environment in the natural environment, we have here in small flasks the same organisms that are able to be studied in a controlled laboratory setting. So all of these are going to evaluate how organisms or communities react to environmental change that is imposed upon them, like changes in temperature, changes in oxygen, or carbon dioxide content. So why do we want to study these changes? It's all about getting at this concept of equilibrium. And equilibrium is the steady state of an ecosystem where all organisms are in balance with their environment and with each other. And in ecology, there are two main features that characterize the equilibrium of a community or of an ecosystem. Number one, we have resistance. Resistance is the ability of an ecosystem to remain at equilibrium in spite of disturbances. Resistance in a community is usually associated with functional redundancy, where you might have more than one primary producer in an environment, and therefore a disturbance might get rid of one primary producer, but not all of them necessarily. The second feature contributing to ecosystem equilibrium is resilience. Resilience is the speed at which an ecosystem recovers to that equilibrium point after being disturbed. So again, if you have a pretty complex community with many different species or populations able to serve multiple roles in a community, that ecosystem would have a great amount of resilience. And so ecosystem resistance and resilience are especially important when we're considering human impacts. The nature of an ecosystem can change to such a degree that it can lose its resilience entirely. And this process can lead to complete destruction or irreversible altering of an ecosystem. So this is what we're going to consider in the next slides, the ecosystem resistance and resilience being especially important when considering human impact. The first thing that we have to recognize is more than 60% of Earth's land is used by humans, not only for where we live and habitate and work, but also for cropland, so making our crops, or for rangeland, for making our meats and dairy. What this means and translates to is massive amounts of habitat loss. And so we really picked up this habitat destruction habit as humans during the later half of the 20th century. And it has devastating impacts worldwide, but there's a specific example in the exceptional biodiversity that used to characterize Sumatra. They have one species of orangutan, a species of critically endangered elephant, and also the beautiful Sumatran tiger. Unfortunately, because of devastating habitat loss, destruction, and deforestation, we have destroyed about half of Sumatra's forest. It is now gone. It leaves these animals without a habitat, without places to roam or scavenge for food or raise their young. And all of this can be chalked up to the forest being removed for timber. And in addition to just removing the trees for timber, the land can be reused to plant palm oil plantations. This is a monoculture in the background here of palm trees. Now you may be thinking, okay, they removed the forest and they planted trees. What's so wrong with this? What's so wrong with this is that the inherent biodiversity within that forest was stripped, removed, taken away, and then planted and replaced with a monoculture, or only one type of organism, this palm tree. Now, palm trees may be great if it's maybe one species of an entire community of different species of trees, but when it's the one and only tree in an ecosystem, that has devastating consequences for the organisms that rely and thrive in a biodiverse, rich habitat. I should note that palm oil from these palm trees are used in many products that we use every day, including food and cosmetics. So I would behoove you to look at the items that you shop for at the store and see if it has palm oil in it. If it does, maybe find an alternative. All of this just goes to show that human activities threaten biodiversity. We don't have to be the ones chopping down the trees necessarily, but as consumers, we can make a difference in what we decide to buy, shop for, and show demand for. Next, we have over-harvesting. This rolls right into that habitat loss. And this is when humans clear vast amount of land to make way for farming and for building. This is directly related to something called the tragedy of the commons. And if you have ever heard of this before, you recognize that the people who are forced to make these decisions of deforesting their land, for example, they don't necessarily have a choice. They, for economic reasons, may choose that it's better for their family to profit from the timber sales and also profit from farming out that land. If they had other alternatives to them, they might be able to weigh the consequences of that habitat loss and the environmental devastation that it might cause. But for their sake of themselves and their family, they choose to over-harvest. Next, we have the idea of introduced species. We've already talked about this in terms of invasive species. We'll just revisit this idea again and say that introduced species are those exotic species that are moved from one location to another. This is either by accident or on purpose, and this could have devastating effects for the biodiversity of an area simply because that exotic species may overtake that area, either through overpredation of the prey items there or through interspecific competition for resources, shelter, and food. So how does this roll into us and the trend of global human population growth? Actually, for most of human history, the human population has not really grown too much. It's grown pretty slowly at a global scale. It's only really within the past recent decades that we've seen this massive explosion. So the human population growth, of course, depends on birth rates and death rates. And we've done a great deal of things to reduce our death rates and increase our birth rates as a human population. Number one, we have the introduction of farming. That's provided stable food supply. So birth rates have gone up. We've been able to support bigger and bigger families. We've also declined our death rates by the introduction of modern medicine and antibiotics. And also we've done a whole lot for the majority of the globe, increase our sanitation practices and effective removal of waste and access to clean water. Now, that's not to say that clean water is accessible to every community. Of course, it's not, especially in Flint, Michigan, in the United States, for example. But by and large, these advances in modern medicine, nutrition, and sanitation have caused a massive decline in our death rates. So all of this put together has caused a dramatic increase in the human population at a global scale. So here we can take a look at the generalized population age structures of different regions on the globe, including the United States. And so just to orient you with how to read this diagram, over on the left of each of these panels are the male individuals in a country. Over on the right, we have the female individuals. The colors are speaking to the age of these individuals. If the bar is red, that means that those individuals are aged 0 to 14. They're considered pre-reproductive age. If the bar is yellow, that is ages 15 to 44. Reproductive age considered from 15 to 44. And then if the bar is blue, that means those individuals are aged 45 to over 85 years old, and they are considered to be in post-reproductive ages. You can look at the shape of these age structure diagrams to get an understanding at how fast or how slow a population of humans is increasing. So let's take a look at these countries with an age structure diagram that suggests that they are expanding rapidly. This is Nigeria, Saudi Arabia, and Guatemala. Notice that they have a whole lot of individuals, both male and female, who are at their pre-reproductive ages. That means that these individuals are going to start reproducing within about 20 years or so, and we already have a good number of individuals who are reproducing right now, which means we can predict that their population in these countries are going to expand very rapidly. Next, we have countries like the United States, Australia, and China that have a skinnier age structure diagram. This means that there are more males and females who are post-reproduction age, and the expansion is going to still happen because we still have individuals that are pre-reproduction age and in their reproductive ages, but not nearly as many as the countries that are expanding rapidly. Next, we have an even skinnier still age structure diagram representing countries like Italy, Japan, and Greece. Notice that there's probably just as many post-reproduction age individuals as pre- and reproduction age individuals, meaning that their population is pretty stable. And then finally, with a top-heavy diagram, we have the countries Germany, Bulgaria, and Russia, who have the majority of their individuals in their population post-reproduction age, meaning that in the coming years, there aren't going to be too many individuals who will be able to reproduce and replace those who have died. Check out the TED Ed video all about predicting future population dynamics with these age structure pyramids. So predicting future population growth is actually pretty difficult, and the future growth rate varies because we don't really understand what could happen in terms of birth rates or death rates. And of course, questions remain as to whether or not the Earth will have capacity to hold or carry that many humans. And if we learned anything from the David Attenborough film, we understand that the Earth will persist, but the question is, will we?